Welcome to the Journal Editorial Report. I'm Paul Gigot. Special Counsel Robert Mueller delivered his long-awaited report to Attorney General William Barr on Friday, concluding his nearly two-year investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 election. Right now, Barr and Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein are at the Department of Justice reviewing that report, while House Democrats are holding a conference call to discuss their next steps. John Roberts is at the White House with the very latest. John.
Paul, good afternoon to you. The long-awaited Mueller report, of which we know absolutely nothing. As you pointed out, the Attorney General, the Deputy Attorney General are reviewing it. We had thought that we might see some results of it. That would have been sort of the top-line findings, the conclusions by 5 o'clock this afternoon. But now we are told that that's not going to happen, and we'll likely see it sometime tomorrow at the very earliest. A White House source told me yesterday it would probably not be until sometime late Sunday that we would see it. Now it appears overly ambitious, this idea that we would have gotten something out today. The president having a leisurely Saturday. He was at the Trump International Golf Club in West Palm Beach, just got back to Mar-a-Lago. He certainly is taking a lot of comfort from the fact, Paul, that Robert Mueller said in delivering the report that he is not going to seek any more indictments, which would be an indication that the president, in terms of the Russia investigation, collusion and obstruction of justice, is likely in the clear, prompting this response from his attorney, Rudy Giuliani, to Fox News yesterday. This marks the end of the Russia investigation. We await a disclosure of the facts. We are confident that there is no finding of collusion by the president, and this underscores what the president has been saying from the beginning, that he did nothing wrong. The president has spent months now trying to undermine the legitimacy of the Mueller investigation, the very premise upon which it was built, and on his way out of the White House yesterday, on his way to Mar-a-Lago, he was doing exactly the same thing. Listen here.
We're going to see what happens. It's going to be very interesting, but we'll see what happens. There was no collusion. There was no obstruction. Everybody knows it. It's all a big hoax. I call it the witch hunt. It's all a big hoax. So we'll see what happens. I know that the Attorney General, highly respected, ultimately will make a decision.
So where do we go from here? Again, the Attorney General, the Deputy Attorney General reviewing it. If there is material that may be subject to executive privilege, that man standing right there beside the president may have something to say about it. That is Emmett Flood, who is the president's in-house counsel on the Mueller investigation. He and Pat Cipollone, the White House counsel, may have to review any materials before they are released in case they have to claim executive privilege, or maybe there's a request to waive executive privilege, or maybe they ask for some redactions. Now, Democrats at the same time are asking for the entire report to be released, but that would include a lot of sensitive materials. So that is a wrestling match that could go on for weeks, if not months. Of course, there are other investigations going on as well at the Southern District of New York, in Congress, plenty to keep Democrats busy through November 3rd, 2020. Now, I said at the top of this, Paul, that in terms of indictments, it looks on the surface, at least, as though the president is out of the woods. What we don't know is if he's out of the woods politically, because we don't know what might be contained in the report. But we got an indication of how the report may go in a letter that was transmitted from Rod Rosenstein, the Deputy Attorney General, to the then chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, Charles Grassley, last June, in which Rosenstein said that prosecutors do not like to talk about misconduct among people who are not being charged. So if it is that there are no more indictments, that would indicate the president is not being charged with anything. And so, therefore, the report might not say anything about any misconduct on the president's part. There's also been this theory of maybe there's a sealed indictment somewhere that's waiting to be opened when the president gets out of office. I'm told by a knowledgeable source it's likely that that didn't happen, because Mueller would have had to get permission from the Department of Justice to do that. And that would have been a huge process that probably would have raised some alarm bells somewhere along the lines. Paul?
All right. Thank you, John. Let's bring in our panel, Wall Street Journal columnist and deputy editor Dan Henniger, and columnists Kim Strassel and Bill McGurn. So let's talk about what we do know here from these early innings. Kim, how significant is it that that Mueller has said the report suggests that there will be no more indictments?
Well, it's enormously important, Paul, because remember, the charge against this president was among the most serious you could have, that essentially they were aiding a foreign government. And this was the basis of collusion. Not only that, the FBI used some of the most aggressive tools that they had to go after that. So the fact that there is no finding here, I think, is going to put some new spotlight on the FBI as well in terms of what they were doing all along. But it also just means that the president, at least in that area, can go forward, presumably vindicated on the shadow that has hung over this administration from the minute it stepped in.
Well, we don't know about what the narrative will be yet, if there is going to be an narrative. We want to talk about that a little later. But on this point about the indictments, remember, a lot of people talked about Don Jr.'s vulnerability because of the Trump Tower meeting with Russians, okay? What about some of the other potential contacts with WikiLeaks on the leak of the documents? If there are no indictments on that, it means that Mueller has not uncovered any criminal activity for any of these people. And remember, just think about it in the alternative. What if he had indicted Donald Jr.? That would have been a typhoon.
Federal prosecutors speak with indictments, right? And how Mr. Mueller has spoken in the past is through his filings and other indictments. So it's a big deal. If you go back to the original part of this, the accusation was a serious one, that the president's team was conspiring with the Russians to steal the election. And remember, Devin Nunes issued a report, I think, more than a year ago.
He's former House Intelligence chairman.
And they didn't find this. So it's just going to be interesting to see, do we accept the findings of the most exhaustive investigation you could probably have, or do they go down other rabbit holes, or does the House start its impeachment proceedings on this?
And we want to, and that's not over yet. We got to wait to see the report. But there's another thing here, Dan, and that's interesting, is now we know that the president was never interviewed by Robert Mueller. Remember all the discussion about that, whether he would subpoena him before the grand jury? Now we know that the gamble that the president's lawyers took not to submit to an interview, just to submit to written questions, paid off.
Yeah, and we know that was a back and forth with the president himself frequently saying, I'd be happy to sit down with Robert Mueller.
Sure.
And his lawyers saying, please don't go there because you could get yourself into trouble. They controlled it. They did written questions, and the prosecutor, Robert Mueller, seems to have been satisfied with that. And so you've ended up with a report apparently that does not indict the president. And as Bill was suggesting, Robert Mueller, professional prosecutor, famously a man of very few words. When he was nominated to be the head of the FBI, he spoke for about 45 seconds. And his position has always been the prosecutor's work should speak for them. Now, the question here, Paul, is whether the public, the Democrats, and political world at large is going to let it stop there. Because the Mueller investigation, one of the things we know is the famous Mueller investigation is over, all right? The 22-month investigation is done. But politically, it probably is not done.
The other issue here, Bill, is this issue of whether there was any obstruction with the probe. And we know from the letter that Barr sent to the House and Senate Judiciary Committee on Friday that there were no such instances where anything that Mueller wanted to do were interfered with by senior Justice Department officials. Now, that's very significant as well, because remember all the discussion about how, Mueller needs to be protected.
Special legislation, to protect Mueller. Look, this is a pattern with Donald Trump, that accusations, it looks, he's a dead man because of these. I mean, I remember when the Steele dossier came out, and I had no idea whether it was true or not, but I thought if there's any truth to this, he's going to be gone. And then when the reality sinks in a little later, it's a little less sensational. I'd say one thing for the political investigations that are undoubtedly going to continue because the Democrats now control these committees, that's at least a proper venue for this stuff. I mean, as opposed to Andrew McCabe launching an investigation or a special counsel, they have to make a political calculation and let them do it.
But Kim, this is a big deal, it seems to me. If there was, I mean, how many trees died? How many forests were felled with people saying that something had to be done to protect Robert Mueller? And it turns out that he was just fine, at least according to this document.
Yeah, I mean, remember the drama, Paul. We had people in the Senate that were saying they would not go along with other legislation unless we had a bill to protect Robert Mueller. And, you know, all along, and also people suggesting that any time the president did anything, he was in some way obstructing Robert Mueller. If he was going to release documents, or if he fired a particular person here or there in the Justice Department, that could potentially comprise obstruction. I think it's important to note that that has now been removed, which is going to give the president a lot more freedom to act in a lot more areas.
All right, when we come back, Democrats already threatening subpoenas as the special counsel wraps up his probe. So what can't the Attorney General disclose from the Mueller report? We'll ask a former Justice Department prosecutor next.
The Attorney General Barr should be called to testify under oath before the United States Congress.
Absolutely.
The Journal Editorial Report is brought to you by Pacific Life.
First, argue that the department cannot adopt a double standard and should cooperate willingly. But if it doesn't, we will have to subpoena the evidence. We will have to subpoena Mueller or others to come before the Congress and answer questions, because if there is evidence of a compromise, whether it arises to the level of criminal conduct or not, it needs to be exposed.
That was House Intelligence Committee Chairman Adam Schiff yesterday threatening to subpoena Special Counsel Robert Mueller as he wraps up his Russia probe. Let's bring in James Trusty. He's a former Justice Department prosecutor. Welcome back, Mr. Trusty. Great to see you.
You too.
So Bill Barr, the Attorney General, is reading the Mueller report. What is he obliged to do next as a matter of Justice Department rules and the law?
Right. Well, he's actually taken care of one thing in advance, which is the letter that went to Congress yesterday complied with another CFR regulation that says if there's a fundamental disagreement, a veto by the Department of Justice over the special counsel, that has to be reported. So he's already taken care of that part, which really would have been a secondary or an independent report. What's left is figuring out the big question that we're all wrestling with, which is how much actually goes over the wall to Congress, how much of it is redacted. And I think there's going to be several areas of both policy and law that kick in as to what can or can't be seen by congressmen or the public alike.
Does he have to turn over anything at all? If he wanted to say, look, I don't think I want to turn over anything, it's not in the public interest, could he do that?
Yeah, I think the special counsel statute would allow him to just essentially summarize it. So he could do that, but I think, I suspect he's going to be true to his word from the confirmation hearings. I think he's genuinely trying to get as much public as he can, but there's going to be people or conspiracy theorists or whatever that don't like any single line of redaction because they think it's hiding some huge fact.
So what is he thinking about in terms of justice rules when he makes these decisions about what should be redacted? I guess one thing is this point about you're not supposed to smear anybody with innuendo or information if you haven't indicted them. That's one thing he's got to think about.
Right. I mean, that's a DOJ policy side type thing. That's not written into statute. But, you think about Ray Donovan, Secretary of Labor back in the Reagan years, that actually didn't just get in a report, but got tried and acquitted and said, what office do I go to get my reputation back? I think Rod Rosenstein and Mueller are very cognizant of that problem. They don't want to unnecessarily smear people. So that's one layer. But then there's also Federal Rule of Criminal Procedure 6E, which deals with grand jury, and then executive privilege. So there's several layers of possible redaction areas.
And on the other side, you've got the public interest, right? The public's right to know the fact that this has been a contentious part of American politics for more than 2 years, and we have a right to kind of get this settled. So, I mean, some of these things are not an easy decision. And the other thing is, if he decides only to send, say, summary conclusions and not the whole report, you already hear the Democrats saying, well, we got to have the whole report. Then I guess they have the right to subpoena the report and everything?
Well, there's a middle ground, right? You could observe the right rules and policies and redact portions, but not give just a summary report. So there can still be a pretty fulsome document that goes over. But you're right. I mean, the next issue is whether it sounds like they're kind of predisposed to calling people into Congress. But really, the exact same issues that track the disclosure of documents will track the verbal testimony. So there's going to be a lot of areas, and maybe that's the game politically, I don't know, but there's going to be a lot of areas where I think that a Mueller or a Barr or a Rosenstein would feel a little handcuffed in terms of disclosing publicly.
What about the background material? So, for example, we know there's if there are going to be no more indictments, and there's a summary report that says we found some of these things, but the things like the FBI 302s or some of the interviews with witnesses and so on, can Congress subpoena that as well? I guess they can try to get it, but is the Justice Department obliged to turn that over?
Well, that's where it starts to get gray. You start getting into fights of executive privilege. I mean, there is an oversight, a recognition of congressional oversight where they're allowed to kind of peek behind the curtain a little bit and know what perhaps motivated certain decisions. But typically speaking, if they ask for a complete case file, give us everything you have,
right,
there's going to be a lot of resistance from the executive branch. And, you know, there's not a constitutional executive privilege. There's not a statutory one. It's just a function of the checks and balances of our government. So it lends itself to litigation, which means all three branches could get involved. We could spend a little bit more time hashing out what we actually see in this book or what we don't.
Fun. What about Mueller himself testifying? You heard Adam Schiff say that he might subpoena him. Is that something that would have to be that he'd have to pay attention to, Mueller?
I think he would. I mean, I think it's unlikely that there's enough support for the notion of completely ignoring the subpoena. But it's going to be interesting, you know, in the context of not an impeachment proceeding, but in an oversight, in a congressional hearing. There's a little more leeway for the executive branch to push back and say, no, we've done our writing, take a look at that and leave us alone. But I suspect that the politics of the day will be that these folks end up appearing in front of Congress. I also suspect they're pretty compelling witnesses. Guys like Mueller and Barr are not exactly rookies, and so they'll be able to hold their own if they have to come in and testify.
About 20 seconds, but what about this idea of briefing the White House first? The White House said the president would like to see the report, or one of his lawyers did first. Is that smart for Barr to do?
I mean, I think that's really a political calculation, not a legal one, right? There's no legal prohibition. But I think it would be pretty wise to just say, you know, hold on, Mr. President, you're going to see it soon, I swear. You know, celebrate what you know so far. You've read the last page of the book, and you'll have to read the rest of it with the rest of us.
All right. Thank you, James Trusty. Appreciate your being here.
Sure. Good seeing you.
When we come back, we'll tell you what to look for when the Mueller report is finally made public. Attorney General William Barr at the Justice Department right now reviewing Special Counsel Robert Mueller's report. Sources are telling Fox News that Barr could reveal the principal conclusions of that report as early as tomorrow. So what should we be looking for when the Special Counsel's findings are released? We're back with Dan Hitter, Kim Strassel, and Bill McGurn. So, Dan, when you get the narrative or the summary or whatever is finally released, what are you going to be looking for when it comes to the Russian collusion probe?
I'm going to page through and look for the phrase January 2017. That was when Donald Trump was inaugurated, and that was the time when the Russian collusion stories began to appear in the American press. And I will never forget how when those stories began to appear, they would all invariably cite a lot of anonymous intelligence sources. I have never seen so many anonymous sources in my career in journalism. But within an hour or two, every other press outlet would confirm the story, citing their own intelligence sources.
And your inference from that?
It was the same sources talking to all these people. And the question is, who was doing that? Because that drove the Russian collusion story. And I remember back then reading the Clapper report, which is the collection of the intelligence services report on what was going on in the election at that time. That report was primarily about concerns over Russian meddling in election processes here and in Europe. But at some point, that concern about Russian meddling morphed into making Donald Trump himself the target of the media's investigations. How did that happen?
What I'm going to be looking for, Bill, is whether Mueller has a narrative that connects a lot of the disparate facts that we know about ties between Russians and Trump. So the Trump Tower meeting, for example, with a Russian lawyer, the Papadopoulos meeting with some Russians, the Jeff Sessions meeting with a Russian ambassador. There are various little dots on a map but none of them go anywhere
right.
by themselves. Do they add up to anything? That's what I'm looking for.
Well, that's what I'm looking for, to see whether they do add up. Look, to Dan's point, when this was coming out, usually it's the Intelligence Committee that's very sober and says don't get carried away and so forth. We had John Brennan calling Trump treasonous, using that word.
Former CIA
Clapper,
director.
Possibly a Russian agent, Andrew McCabe. I mean, these are the people that are supposed to temper that kind of excitement. I think what I'm going to be looking for, if there's no indictments and no evidence of this, it could very well be that the end of this is going to redound on those people. For example, Andrew McCabe, who ordered an investigation, right? The unmasking, we saw the problem.
Former FBI deputy director.
What the intelligence, to Dan's point, what the intelligence agencies did and how they abetted this with almost no consequence. We still have a lot of questions. No one ever solved the unmasking issue, right? That led to the illegal release of Flynn's thing. There's Andrew McCabe. There's a couple more IG reports coming out.
Right. I want to get to that later in the show. But Kim, let's talk about in the Mueller report. The other big issue is we were thinking about is obstruction of justice. In firing James Comey,
right.
That was a question that Mueller was investigating. Did Trump obstruct justice? What are you looking for on that front?
Well, I think this is going to be an important part as well, too, because people have focused on the collusion side, right? And if there are no indictments, given that it was unlikely that the president committed some grand conspiracy on his own, it suggests that Mueller didn't find any collusion there. Now, the obstruction thing is harder because it's aimed directly at president. And as the president's critics point out, it is not Justice Department policy to indict a sitting president. So does Mueller nonetheless draw a conclusion in this report, which he puts in there, that he felt that some of Trump's actions were irresponsible or aimed at obstruction? Because that doesn't necessarily mean that he doesn't think that Trump did something wrong, just that he didn't think that he could indict him. So that, I think, is a somewhat perilous part of this report that exists out there still for the president. We'll have to see what it says.
Yeah, he could say to Mueller, Mueller could say, look, I have reason to wonder if the president was trying to interfere with the probe, but I really couldn't find out because I couldn't interview the president personally, or because this is part of his Article 2 powers as president to fire the FBI director.
Correct. I mean, and he could say that. He could also say a number of other things about whether or not he felt the president. I mean, he might even make commentary on the president's ongoing complaints about the special counsel probe, or comments about the Justice Department, which obviously has been a theme for the last year. We just don't know. Look, part of this, Paul, is whether or not Robert Mueller viewed his job here as prosecutorial, meaning was it simply to see whether or not there was a crime and to point it out, or was he viewing it as investigatory and then as a result something that he feels that he needs to comment at length on everyone's behavior?
All right, thank you, Kim. Still ahead, House Democrats on a conference call at this hour planning their next steps now that the Mueller probe has concluded. We'll go to Capitol Hill for the House Democrats are on a conference call right now to discuss their messaging after the Mueller report's release. Let's go to Peter Doocy on Capitol Hill for more. Peter.
Paul, it's being described by organizers as an emergency caucus conference call. Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, sent Democratic lawmakers an email about this call that's happening right now, where she explained this: we are insisting that any briefings to any committees be unclassified so that members can speak freely about every aspect of the report and not be confined to what DOJ chooses to release publicly. Even if DOJ chooses not to prosecute additional individuals, the underlying findings must be provided to Congress and the American people. If that doesn't happen, House Judiciary Chair Jerry Nadler says he will compel Robert Mueller to testify. Democrats in Congress seem to be on board with a subpoena for Mueller if he will not break his years-long silence willingly, as Democrats on the campaign trail are trying to spin what they know so far.
Now, I don't know what's in the report. Nobody does. I do know, however, that Mueller wound up indicting 34 people, including 6 Trump campaign officials.
But because 0 Trump campaign officials have been or will be indicted by the special counsel for colluding with the Kremlin to throw an election, Republicans now want to make sure the record is straight on that stat.
I think there were some people over there that wanted this outcome, they wanted that outcome, and didn't get it. Who's going to be held accountable? How many tens of millions of taxpayer dollars were spent meandering around on what many have called a witch hunt? I think that ought to be part of the report.
Both sides of the aisle are calling for transparency today, but neither side of the aisle knows exactly what that will produce. Paul?
All right. Thank you very much, Peter. Let's bring back our panel, Wall Street Journal columnist and deputy editor Dan Henninger and columnist Kim Strassel and Bill McGurn. So it looks like in the early innings here, Bill, the Democratic strategy is transparency and more transparency. Get it all out.
Yeah, well, I'm for that. It's a marked change, remember, from how they behaved when Devin Nunes was trying to get documents out of the Justice Department and the FBI. But I would say I think the Journal is, broadly speaking, in favor of the Barr position. Be as transparent as you can. The people deserve this. And I think that includes not just the information from the special counsel, but other information, the FISA warrants, the full extent, all the redacted material, the especially the letter that Rod Rosenstein wrote outlining the scope of the investigation. Because, you know, you're supposed to have a crime first when you appoint special counsel, not go looking for a crime. So I think there's a lot of secret testimony. I want it all out. Let us measure it all.
Dan, as a political matter, the Democrats invested a lot of expectation in Special Counsel Mueller as a prosecutor and finding indictments. Did they put too much expectation into Mueller? Because if there are no more indictments, and there is no indictment for collusion or conspiracy, then what, I mean, is this a setback for them politically?
Well, I think that is the key question. This is a political issue. They did load up everything on the Mueller investigation. Right. It lasted for 22 months. We have arrived at this point. There are not going to be any indictments. And I guess the question now is this the point at which the real witch hunt begins, which is to say the Democratic witch hunt, continuing forward, demanding that Mueller give them everything that he found out. I have to tell you, Paul, I'm beginning to have second thoughts about this idea of transparency. Do we really want to spend the next 2 years wallowing in every piece of information that Robert Mueller had, every conversation that his attorneys and prosecutors had with one another for political effect? Because I think the American people are pretty much, unless they just hate Donald Trump, are pretty much tired of this process.
Kim, what's your response to Dan? Because you and I have been arguing for transparency. What do you think about that, Dan's point?
No, look, I think we have to have transparency, okay? One, obviously for political reasons. My own view is that Democrats are rooting for Bill Barr to actually keep some of this secret. And you heard that in Nancy Pelosi's statement that was just read, because they would like to present this as a cover-up, okay? If there is not transparency, they're going to claim it's because the Department of Justice, working at the behest and on behalf of the president, is hiding things and keeping things from the public. So I think that's to their political advantage. But secondly, Paul, the Mueller report is only the end of the second part of this. We don't know how it all still started. And the American people deserve that answer, too. If there is no indictments for this most serious of accusations, and this FBI that used the most serious of surveillance tools against American citizens, then people need to know how folks at the highest echelons of our government ever got motivated to go down that road and felt that it was appropriate. And that, of course, gets into things like the dossier, etc.
Yeah, that's why you want to, I want to know, you know, how this FBI got involved with this. Why did they trust the Steele dossier, or did they? And did they submit it to the FISA court for warrants? I want to know that.
Was this a Glenn Simpson orchestrated effort?
He's the Fusion
GPA working for Hillary Clinton to get an FBI investigation on an opposition leader. I will say the healthy part now, even if the Democrats go overboard, is, again, under our Constitution, that's the proper venue because there's some accountability. They'd pay a price for it, which Andrew McCabe doesn't pay, you know, when he orders an investigation, and even special counsel does. Clearly, Mrs. Pelosi doesn't think that price is worth it.
I completely take your point, Bill, but let's cut to the chase. For the Democrats, it's all about the I word, impeachment, and whether they're going to find anything in Mueller's report that will allow them to proceed with impeachment against Donald Trump. And are we going to spend the next 2 years with the country embroiled in an impeachment in the House of Representatives? I think the Democrats are taking a risk with the course they're on. Their base is for this, but whether the rest of the American electorate is for, I really have my doubts, Paul.
All right, Dan, when we come back, how do we move on from Mueller? Will the conclusion of the special counsel's investigation settle anything at all? The Mueller investigation finally wrapping up after nearly 2 years that cast a shadow over the Trump presidency. So can the country and lawmakers move on? And will the report's release settle anything? So, Kim, let's put Mueller aside for a second. And where are the Democrats going next when it comes to investigating Donald Trump?
Well, two areas, I think, Paul. One is that they are already instantly pivoting away from this obsession of 2 years, Russia collusion, to talk about the legacy of the Mueller investigation, and in particular, some other areas that were handed off to, for instance, the Southern District of New York, which is now actively investigating things like Trump hush money, these payments to former adult film stars, the Trump inaugural committee and some of its donations, etc. And then I think in Congress, what you're going to see is guys like Adam Schiff, who run the House Intelligence Committee, trying to shift to a second phase of Russia's supposed collusion, which doesn't have anything to do with the election, but rather claims that Trump was doing nefarious things in terms of its investments in Russia, and whether or not they were getting favors, whether or not there was money laundering. It's all, some of this, by the way, also comes from Fusion GPS, the same guy, same people who came up with the Russian collusion narrative, but they're going to pursue that.
So I think the lesson is, Bill, it ain't over.
Right.
And
the Democrats are going to continue. But let me make a little prediction. I think at the end of this, there are still 3 Inspector General reports coming out. One on gifts that accepted by FBI agents, one on the FISA wiretaps, and one on leaks. And Andrew McCabe is kind of in the middle of that. I think at the end of all this stuff, in terms of Russia and the narrative, it could end up being some people like that who are indicted. There's still a U.S. attorney looking into that case. It may be that he was waiting for the special counsel to finish his work. That's also still out there.
Well, you know, in your earlier interview with James Trusty, he suggested that maybe all 3 branches of government would get involved. And we're talking about the courts here, and I can see that coming. Judiciary House Chairman Jerry Nadler is already using the word cover-up. He's going to demand a full document dump from Mueller's office, and I think possibly that Attorney General Barr and Deputy Attorney General Rosenstein will resist some of that. Nadler will then subpoena the report, and I can see the White House and Donald Trump telling the Justice Department to resist that subpoena, at which point we are headed into the courts.
Kim, will there ever be an accounting for the Steele dossier and how it came about and how much it was relied upon by the FBI and the courts?
Look, we can have some hope that those Inspector General reports, the one that is being done, in fact, on this FISA process, will bring some light on that. But my own view is that the only way that you get a full accounting is for the president. Now that this report is done, okay, no one can any longer say that any releases of information are obstructing Mueller's probe in any way. That's important. But what the president needs to do now is release all of those documents that House Republicans were trying to obtain. The FBI's witness interviews, the portions of the FISA application that were redacted that go to the FBI's other efforts, the Woods file, which is this file that explains whether or not they had ever managed to verify the dossier or not. The public needs to see all of this so that it can make its own judgment about the FBI's behavior and so that we can decide whether or not the FBI needs to be subject to some new rules going forward so that this doesn't happen again.
What would it take, in your view, Dan, for Donald Trump to be able to claim vindication? He'll claim it no matter what.
Yes,
but in your view, that it really is vindicated?
Well, I think it will require making public a lot of the Mueller report, and we're going to have to come away with some conclusion about whether the bulk of it really decides whether there indeed was no collusion. Let's keep in mind that is the central point of the Mueller investigation, whether there was Russian-Trump collusion. If there was not, then he can claim vindication.
And if there was not, then and the Democrats keep going and finding something, I mean, they have some political risk.
Yeah, I think, but that's what our system is meant to have. There should be a political calculation in this. So at least there'll be a cost if they go off the cliff on this.
All right, thank you all very much. When we come back, switching gears and turning to the economy, the Fed holds interest rates steady, citing signs of a global economic slowdown. We'll talk to the president's top economist next. The Federal Reserve holding interest rates steady this week and signaling that there will be no increases in 2019, citing slower than expected growth. Fed officials project that the U.S. economy will grow by 2.1% this year. That outlook at odds with the optimistic forecast released this week by the White House, which projects that gross domestic product will expand at or above 3% for the next 5 years. I spoke with Kevin Hassett earlier. He's chair of the White House Council of Economic Advisors. Kevin, good to see you again. Thanks for doing this.
It's great to be back. Thanks.
So I know you don't want to talk about monetary policy, but I do want to ask you about these differing forecasts. And how do you explain the difference?
Or just to be clear, out of respect for monetary policy, let's just compare our forecast to the blue chip forecast, which is about the same as the Fed. And then I'm talking about the blue chip guys, and I'm respecting the independence of the Fed. You know, I think that the bottom line is that about a year ago, you and I were talking about the impact of the tax cuts. I was much more optimistic about because I was basing my estimates on some of the latest literature that said that we'd get a big capital spending boom last year and 3.1% growth. And a lot of the blue chip guys and other government agencies around town, they disagreed with us. And then last year looked just the way we said. And so when we were writing down our forecast for this year, we just got to thinking, gosh, if the first year in our forecast was exactly what we said, and the details are even about exactly what we said, then why would we change our forecast for the second year? And so we pretty much stuck to our guns. The forecast that we have for this year is the same one that we made more than a year ago. And it was because the first year looked just the way our models said it would.
Okay, so yeah, no question. You got it right. You really deserve credit for that. Absolutely. Thanks. But there's a lot of signs that things are not as robust now as they looked back then. And in particular, you had the decline in capital spending, so the second half of the last quarter, third and fourth quarters of last year. And now we've had significant stock market impact, at least for a while in December. And there's a lot more pessimism. I mean, what do you make of that pessimism?
Well, I think that let's talk about the U.S. because I think that there's some pessimism about Europe that's related to Brexit and things that is legitimate. But I think that in the U.S., don't forget that the first quarter right now, our numbers are looking like they're maybe 1.5, and we think that that's maybe about 0.3 low because of the government shutdown, which means you're almost at 2 in the first quarter if you adjust for that. And what's happened going back to 2010 is the first quarter keeps being around 1, and then the second quarter is about 3. And then you sort of, under President Trump have stayed around there or even gone up as we've moved forward. And so I think that we're looking at about a 1 something in the first quarter and then another 3 in the second quarter. And there are a lot of signs that that's what's going on. I mean, if you look at equity markets, how much they've bounced back since December, the National Association of Manufacturers just surveyed their manufacturers for the first quarter of this year. And something like, I think it was about 92% of them have an optimistic outlook for the year and are looking to expand. And so I think that basically we're going to have another year like we've had where we have a slow first quarter and then we bounce back.
Okay, just one final question, and that's about wages. They're growing at about 3.4%, the best since about 2009. Do you see that continuing? And I guess how many more workers can we pull off the sidelines here to keep this, because, that's important to growth. Can we pull off the sidelines to keep the economy growing?
For me, actually, Paul, the most important wage number is that the bottom 10% just saw their wages grow 6.5% in the most recent quarter. And so what's happening is the capital spending is causing low-wage workers to see wage increases unlike anything we've seen really going back to the late 1990s during the dot-com boom. And so with those wages growing so fast at the bottom, that's attracting people who were discouraged in the past back into the labor force. And 73% of the people that were new hires in the last jobs report came from out of the labor force. And so we're seeing a stampede back into the labor market. And I think that, in our forecast, we think that that's going to continue. It's another reason why, going back to where we started, why are we more optimistic? We think this is going to continue. And a lot of people think that the retirement of the baby boomers is dooming us to declining labor force participation, but we disagree.
All right, Kevin Hassett, the White House counsel. Time now for our hits and misses of the week. Kim, first to you.
So, Paul, award for most embarrassing university, and my miss for this week goes to Harvard, where both students and faculty are engaged in a backlash against law professor Ronald Sullivan, who has agreed to sit on the defense team of Harvey Weinstein, who's been accused of rape. We're having sit-ins, protests, students saying that they don't feel comfortable being taught by a professor who condones sexual assault. Harvard is actually indulging this instead of forcing its students to understand some bedrock principles, like the fact that everyone's entitled to an attorney, and lawyers that represent them don't necessarily condone those actions.
All right, Bill.
Miss to the Southern Poverty Law Center. This is a liberal group, that started out good going after the Ku Klux Klan, but is morphed into a group that calls conservatives, anyone insufficiently woke on feminism or marriage or so forth, racists and extremists and so forth. It's lost some libel suits on that. Well, it turns out it has its problems of its own. It recently fired its co-director and director and co-founder, and now the president has stepped down because of accusations of racial bias and sexual discrimination. Look, if they had any decency, they'd shut the whole thing down, but it has a $300 million endowment, so you know what's going on.
Dan.
I'm giving a miss to Nancy Pelosi, who said recently that she thinks it would be a good idea to reduce the voting age to 16 years old. 16 years old. I thought 18 was a bad idea. It was probably a Freudian slip, though, when she said, I think it's really important to capture kids when they're in high school. Don't try it, Nancy.
That's it for this week's show. Thanks to my panel, and thanks to all of you for watching. I'm Paul Gigot. Hope to see you right here next week.
And we